The morning sun cast long shadows across my perfectly manicured lawn as I walked to the mailbox, just as I had every morning for the past 15 years. At 62, retired from the Army after 25 years of service, I'd found peace in this quiet Texas suburb. Little did I know that the envelope waiting for me would ignite a battle I never expected, a fight for justice against my own HOA that would become one of the most satisfying HOA revenge stories I've ever heard. There it was. The official-looking envelope from the Heritage Heights Homeowners Association. I'd received plenty of notices over the years, reminders about lawn care, holiday decoration guidelines, the usual suburban minutia. But this one felt different, heavier, more ominous. I ripped it open right there at the curb, my fingers trembling slightly. As my eyes scanned the contents, the blood drained from my face. Violation notice. Unauthorized structure. Fines. 10-0. Subject. Property line fence. I read it again. Certain I must be misunderstanding. The letter claimed my fence, the one I'd built 10 years ago with the HOA's approval, was now in violation. Not just a small violation either. They were fining me $10,000 and demanding I remove it within 30 days. What in God's name? I muttered to myself, looking at the fence that had stood without issue for a decade. My neighbors, Tom and Linda, were walking their golden retriever. They waved, but stopped when they saw my expression. "You all right, Mark?" Tom called out. I held up the letter, my hand shaking slightly. "O is fining me 10 grand for my fence, the same fence they approved 10 years ago." Linda's eyes widened. "That's ridiculous! Everyone on this street has a fence!" I nodded, trying to process this. I need to head to the HOA office. Something's not right here. As I walked back to my house, I noticed something that made me pause. The fence line, was it always this close to the property marker? I'd built it myself, carefully following the survey I'd done when I first bought the property. But now, looking at it, no, I was probably overthinking it. Still, the unease settled deep in my gut. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about principle. And as a retired Army officer, I knew a thing or two about standing my ground. Have you ever received an unexpected fine from your HOA? A. Yes, it was resolved quickly. B. Yes, it led to a major dispute. C. No, never had issues. D. I don't live in an HOA community. The Heritage Heights HOA office was exactly what you'd expect in a Texas suburb, impeccably maintained, with professionally framed community photos on the wall and a receptionist who smiled like she'd been trained to do nothing else. "I need to speak with someone about this violation notice," I said, sliding the letter across the counter. The receptionist, Brenda, barely glanced at it. "Mr. Henderson, I'm afraid the board's decision is final. The fence violates our current architectural guidelines." I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. "Brenda, I've lived here for 15 years. This fence was approved by the HOA when I built it. How can it suddenly be in violation?" She gave me a practiced sympathetic look. "Guidelines change, Mr. Henderson. The board updated the architectural standards last year. All fences must now be set back exactly 8 feet from property lines. Yours is only 6 feet back." I felt my blood pressure rising. No one notified me of this change. And even if they had, grandfather clauses usually apply to existing structures. Brenda's smile tightened. "The board decided not to grandfather existing fences. They want uniformity throughout the community." Uniformity. That word hit me wrong. In the military, uniformity had a purpose. Here, it just felt like control for control's sake. "I need to see the board meeting minutes where this decision was made," I said firmly. Brenda's smile finally faltered. "I'm afraid that's not possible without a formal records request." "Then I'll submit one," I said, pulling out a pen and writing on the back of the violation notice. "Right now." As I filled out the form, Brenda made a call. I could hear her murmuring, then she hung up and turned back to me. "The board president, Mrs. Davenport, can see you for 5 minutes at 3 o'clock today." I checked my watch. It was noon. "I'll be here." The next 3 hours were a blur of phone calls. First to my daughter Sarah, a lawyer in Austin, then to the county assessor's office. Finally, to the surveyor who had originally mapped my property. Sarah was especially concerned. Dad, this sounds like one of those HOA revenge stories you read about online. $10,000 is excessive, and changing rules without proper notification could be illegal. I know, I sighed, but I need more information before we go nuclear. The county assessor's office was helpful. They confirmed my property dimensions matched what I'd always understood. The surveyor promised to pull my original file and email me copies. Armed with this information, I returned to the HOA office at 2:55 p.m. Mrs. Davenport was exactly what I expected. Perfectly coiffed hair, designer suit, and an air of absolute authority. She'd been HOA president for 5 years and ruled with an iron fist. "Mr. Henderson," she said, not bothering to stand as I entered her office. "I understand you have questions about your fence." "I do," I said, taking a seat across from her. "Specifically, why a structure that was approved a decade ago is suddenly in violation, and why the fine is so excessive." Mrs. Davenport folded her hands on her desk. "The Heritage Heights community has standards, Mr. Henderson. Those standards evolve to maintain property values and community aesthetics. Your fence no longer meets those standards. Even though it was approved when built." She gave a slight shrug. "Approvals are based on current guidelines. When guidelines change, so do compliance requirements." "And the $10,000 fine?" I pressed. "That seems punitive rather than corrective. The fine structure is clearly outlined in the HOA bylaws, which you agreed to when you purchased your home." Mrs. Davenport checked her watch. "Your 5 minutes are almost up. Is there anything else?" I stood, forcing myself to remain calm. "Yes, actually. I've submitted a formal request for the board meeting minutes where this change was approved, as well as notification records sent to homeowners." Mrs. Davenport's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Those requests will be processed in accordance with state law. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment." I left feeling frustrated but determined. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about a system that seemed designed to bully homeowners into compliance without due process. As I drove home, my phone buzzed. It was the surveyor, with the documents I'd requested. When I pulled into my driveway and opened the email, what I found made my heart skip a beat. The original survey showed something I'd completely forgotten, a notation about the property line being different from what the HOA had always claimed. My fence wasn't 6 feet from the property line as they'd stated. According to the original survey, my fence was actually 2 feet inside my property line. The HOA had been fining me for a fence that wasn't just compliant, it was entirely on my land. That night, I barely slept. The discovery that my fence was actually on my property changed everything. This wasn't just about HOA overreach anymore. It was about false claims and potential fraud. The next morning, I called Sarah again. "You need to see this," I said, sending her the survey documents. There was silence on the other end as she reviewed them. "Dad, this is significant. If the HOA has been misrepresenting property lines, they could be liable for more than just dropping this fine." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "If they've been using incorrect property lines to enforce rules, fines, or assessments against other homeowners, this could be a class action situation." I rubbed my temples. "I don't want to start a war, Sarah. I just want them to leave me alone about my fence." "I understand," she said. "But we need to approach this strategically. First, let's get a current survey done to confirm nothing has changed. Then we'll need to look at HOA records, property deeds, and see if this is a pattern." Over the next week, that's exactly what we did. I hired a new surveyor to verify the property lines. Sarah filed formal requests for HOA records, including meeting minutes, architectural guidelines, and enforcement actions against other homeowners. The new survey confirmed what the original one showed: my fence was well within my property boundaries. In fact, the HOA's claimed property line was actually encroaching on my land by 2 feet. While waiting for the HOA records request to be processed, I started talking to neighbors. Casually at first, then more directly. "Hey, Tom," I said one morning as he was walking his dog. "Did you get any notification about the fence guideline changes last year?" Tom shook his head. "Nope, but Mary down the street got fined for her shed last month. Something about it being too close to the property line." My ears perked up. "How much was the fine?" "5,000, Tom said. She was furious, said she'd built it with HOA approval years ago. This was becoming a pattern. I made a point of talking to more neighbors over the next few days. By the end of the week, I'd identified 7 other homeowners who had been fined for structures that were previously approved. The HOA records finally arrived, a thick packet of documents that Sarah and I spent the weekend reviewing. What we found was disturbing. The board had indeed changed the architectural guidelines, increasing the setback requirements for fences, sheds, and other structures. But there was no record of proper notification to homeowners. No grandfather clause for existing structures. And, most troubling, no formal survey to verify property lines before issuing fines. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a section of the meeting minutes. They specifically discussed how the new guidelines would generate additional revenue through fines. Additional revenue. That's what homeowners were to them. A revenue stream. We also discovered that Mrs. Davenport's landscaping company had been awarded the contract to remove non-compliant structures at premium rates. The same company was then hired to install new, compliant structures again at premium rates. "This is a racket," I said, feeling sick to my stomach. "They're changing rules to create violations, fining homeowners, and then steering the repair work to Mrs. Davenport's company." Sarah nodded grimly. "It's worse than that. They're using incorrect property lines to claim violations where none exist. Your fence isn't the only one that's actually compliant with the true property boundaries." We spent the next several days building our case. Sarah contacted a property rights attorney she knew from law school. I reached out to the other homeowners who had been fined, sharing what we'd discovered. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone wanted to join the fight. By the end of the week, we had 8 homeowners ready to take legal action against the HOA. Our attorney, Jessica, reviewed all the evidence and agreed to take the case on contingency. "This is one of the clearest cases of HOA abuse I've ever seen," she said. "We have multiple violations of state law, not to mention potential fraud." We decided to start with a formal demand letter to the HOA board, outlining our findings and requesting they drop all fines and cease enforcement of the improperly adopted guidelines. We gave them 10 days to respond. "Should we tell the local media?" I asked Jessica. "Not yet," she advised. "Let's see how they respond to the letter first. If they refuse to cooperate, then we'll consider media exposure." The 10 days passed with no response from the HOA. On the 11th day, Jessica filed a lawsuit against the Heritage Heights Homeowners Association, naming Mrs. Davenport and the entire board individually. That same day, I received a certified letter from the HOA, not a response to our demand, but another violation notice, this time for failure to comply with a previous violation. They had upped the fine to $15,000. The second violation notice was the last straw. As I stood in my kitchen holding the letter, I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same kind I used to feel before a mission in the Army. This was a battle now, and I was fully committed. Sarah arrived that evening with a strategy. "Dad, we need to go public with this. The HOA isn't backing down, and the court case could take months. We need to put pressure on them." "How?" I asked, though I already suspected her answer. "Local media, social media, community forums. We need to make sure everyone in Heritage Heights knows what's happening." I nodded slowly. "You're right. But I want to do this carefully. No wild accusations, just facts." The next morning, I contacted the local newspaper. A young reporter named Alex Martinez was interested in the story. "HOA disputes are pretty common," he said when we met at a coffee shop. "But what you're describing sounds different, more systematic." I laid out the facts, how the HOA had changed guidelines without proper notification, how they were using incorrect property lines to claim violations, how Mrs. Davenport's company was profiting from the enforcement actions. Alex took detailed notes. "Do you have proof of all this?" I slid a folder across the table. "Original surveys, current surveys, HOA records, communication with other homeowners who were fined, and we have 8 homeowners joining the lawsuit." Alex whistled softly. "This could be big. Heritage Heights is one of the largest communities in the county." The article came out 3 days later. The headline: "Homeowners allege OA scheme to generate fines." The response was immediate. My phone rang constantly, homeowners from Heritage Heights and other communities wanting to share their own experiences. A local TV station picked up the story and interviewed me and two other homeowners from our group. Mrs. Davenport and the HOA board released a brief statement calling the allegations baseless and claiming they were simply enforcing community standards to protect property values. But the tide was turning. More homeowners came forward with similar stories. We discovered that at least 23 families had been fined under the new guidelines, totaling over 150, zero in penalties. Meanwhile, our lawsuit was moving forward. The HOA's attorney filed a motion to dismiss, which Jessica vigorously opposed. "They're claiming we haven't exhausted all administrative remedies within the HOA," she explained during a strategy meeting. "But that's ridiculous when the board itself is the problem." The judge agreed, denying the motion to dismiss and setting a date for discovery to begin. Discovery is where things got really interesting. We requested all HOA communications, financial records, and meeting minutes related to the architectural guidelines and enforcement actions. What we found was damning. Emails between board members discussed specifically targeting certain types of structures that would generate the highest fines. Financial records showed a significant increase in violation revenue over the past year. And meeting minutes revealed that the board had consulted with an attorney who warned them about potential legal issues with their approach, but they had voted to proceed anyway. Most explosive were the records showing that Mrs. Davenport's landscaping company had received over 200 in contracts from the HOA in the past year, more than triple the amount from the previous year. "This is fraud," Jessica said, reviewing the documents. "Plain and simple." Armed with this information, we amended our lawsuit to include specific allegations of fraud and unjust enrichment. We also filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office requesting an investigation into the HOA's practices. The response from the HOA was swift and vicious. They sent out a community newsletter claiming that our lawsuit was threatening the financial stability of the community and endangering property values. They implied that the legal fees could result in higher HOA dues for everyone. The divide in the neighborhood became visible. Some homeowners, worried about their property values, began to distance themselves from our group. Others, however, became more supportive, especially after we shared some of the evidence we'd uncovered. One evening, as I was watering my lawn, Mrs. Davenport herself drove by and stopped her car. "You're making a terrible mistake, Mark," she said through her open window. "Am I?" I replied, turning off the hose. "By standing up for my rights? By exposing what looks like fraud?" Her face hardened. "You're destabilizing the community. People are worried." "People should be worried," I countered. "They should be worried that their HOA is fining them based on incorrect information. They should be worried that board members are profiting from enforcement actions. That's what I'm worried about." Mrs. Davenport's lips tightened into a thin line. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed. "It's not." As she drove away, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no going back. I never thought I'd be in this position at 62 years old, fighting my own neighbors, battling an organization that was supposed to represent our interests. But sometimes, doing the right thing means standing up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it makes you unpopular. The weeks following the confrontation with Mrs. Davenport were tense. The neighborhood had clearly divided into two camps, those who supported our fight against the HOA and those who believed we were causing unnecessary trouble. What surprised me most was who ended up in each camp. Some of my closest neighbors, people I'd shared BBQs and holiday parties with, began avoiding me. Others, whom I barely knew beyond a wave from the driveway, became unexpected allies. One such ally was Bill Jensen, a retired accountant who lived 3 streets over. He approached me as I was getting my mail one afternoon. "Mark, I've been following what's happening with the HOA," he said, looking around nervously. "I think I might have some information that could help." I invited him inside, and over coffee, Bill explained that he had served on the HOA's finance committee for 2 years before resigning in frustration. "I saw things that didn't sit right with me," he said, "financial decisions that seemed to benefit certain board members more than the community." Bill agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing his observations. Most importantly, he revealed that the HOA had maintained a secret reserve fund that wasn't disclosed to homeowners, a fund that had been used to pay for legal fees and other expenses without proper transparency. This could be a violation of state law, Jessica said when I shared Bill's information with her. HOAs in Texas are required to be transparent about their finances. With Bill's affidavit and the financial records we'd obtained through discovery, we filed another complaint, this time with the Texas Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOAs in the state. Our case was getting stronger, but so was the opposition. The HOA hired a high-powered law firm from Dallas to represent them, and they began filing motion after motion in an apparent attempt to drain our resources. "They're trying to outspend us," Jessica warned during a conference call. "They know we're working on contingency, so they're hoping to make this so expensive that we'll give up." But we had an advantage: they hadn't counted on public support. The local media continued to cover the story, and it had begun to spread beyond our community. A statewide property rights organization reached out, offering support and resources. Even a state legislator expressed interest, citing our case as an example of why HOA reform legislation was needed. The most unexpected ally, however, came from within the HOA board itself. One evening, I received a call from a blocked number. A woman's voice, whispering, asked if I could meet her at a park a few miles from Heritage Heights. "Who is this?" I asked, suspicious. "My name is Susan Reynolds. I'm on the HOA board with Mrs. Davenport. I need to talk to you off the record." I was skeptical, but agreed to meet. At the park, Susan looked over her shoulder nervously before speaking. "I've been on the board for 3 years, she explained. "At first, I thought we were just doing what was best for the community. But over the past year, things have changed. Mrs. Davenport has become more controlling, more focused on enforcement and fines." She took a deep breath. "What you've uncovered, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The board has been discussing ways to increase revenue through fines for months. They even talked about hiring a private security company to patrol the neighborhood and issue violations." Susan revealed that the board had deliberately avoided proper notification of guideline changes because they knew many homeowners would object. They figured that by the time people found out, enough fines would have been issued that the HOA would have the money to fight any legal challenges. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because it's wrong," Susan said firmly. "I got involved in the HOA to help our community, not to exploit it. And I'm not the only board member who feels this way. 2 others are uncomfortable with what's happening, but they're afraid to speak up." Susan agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing the board's discussions and decisions. She also promised to try to persuade the other dissenting board members to come forward. Armed with this new information, Jessica filed a motion for an emergency injunction to stop the HOA from collecting any more fines under the disputed guidelines until the lawsuit was resolved. The judge granted the motion, citing substantial evidence of procedural irregularities and potential fraud. The injunction was a major victory, but it also escalated tensions in the neighborhood. The HOA sent out another newsletter, this time claiming that the lawsuit was costing the community thousands of dollars in legal fees and preventing the board from enforcing necessary standards. Mrs. Davenport began showing up at community events, accompanied by other board members, to answer homeowners' questions about the lawsuit. Their talking points were carefully crafted to paint our group as troublemakers who didn't care about the community. But the tide was turning. More homeowners were coming forward with stories of heavy-handed enforcement and questionable fines. A local investigative reporter began digging into the HOA's finances, uncovering even more irregularities. And then came the news that the Texas Real Estate Commission had opened a formal investigation into the Heritage Heights HOA's practices. You know, when this started, I felt alone. I thought it was just me against this powerful organization. But that's the thing about standing up for what's right. You rarely stay alone for long. People will surprise you. Allies will come from unexpected places. And that's what gives me hope. Not just for my situation, but for anyone facing down a bully, whether it's an HOA or something else entirely. The Texas Real Estate Commission's investigation changed everything. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just fighting a lawsuit from a group of homeowners, they were defending themselves against a state agency with subpoena power and the authority to impose significant penalties. The first sign of panic from the HOA board came in the form of an emergency meeting announced with just 24 hours notice, technically legal, but clearly designed to limit attendance. When Sarah and I arrived, we found the meeting room packed, mostly with HOA supporters. Mrs. Davenport called the meeting to order, her face a mask of calm control. The purpose of this emergency meeting is to discuss the lawsuit and the state investigation, and to determine how the board should respond. She outlined the board's position that they had done nothing wrong, that the lawsuit was frivolous, and that the state investigation was politically motivated. Then she opened the floor for comments, and that's when things got interesting. Homeowner after homeowner stood up to defend the HOA, praising Mrs. Davenport's leadership and expressing concern about property values. But then Tom, my neighbor, stood up. "I've lived in Heritage Heights for 20 years, he began, "and I've never seen anything like what's happening now. Fines for structures that were approved years ago, property lines that don't match official surveys, board members profiting from enforcement actions. Is this really what we want our community to be about?" The room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Davenport banged her gavel. "This meeting is not for airing personal grievances, Tom. Please stick to the agenda." Tom ignored her. "I received a violation notice last week for my shed, the same shed I built with HOA approval 15 years ago. The fine? $7,500. When I asked to see the survey they used to determine it was in violation, they told me it wasn't available." More murmurs. Louder this time. Then Susan Reynolds, the board member who had met with me secretly, stood up. "As a member of this board, I can confirm that proper procedures were not followed when the architectural guidelines were changed," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "Homeowners were not properly notified, and no consideration was given to grandfathering existing structures." The room went silent. Mrs. Davenport stared at Susan, her face pale with shock. "Furthermore," Susan continued, "there have been discussions about increasing revenue through fines and about steering enforcement, related work to businesses with connections to board members." Another board member stood up. "I can confirm what Susan is saying. I've been uncomfortable with the direction of this board for months, but I didn't know how to stop it." A third board member nodded in agreement. Mrs. Davenport was visibly flustered now. "This is outrageous! These allegations are completely unfounded." But the damage was done. The meeting descended into chaos as homeowners began shouting questions and accusations. Mrs. Davenport finally adjourned the meeting without taking any action. But the message was clear: the board was fracturing. The next day, Mrs. Davenport and two other board members who remained loyal to her resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons and the toxic environment created by the lawsuit. The remaining board members called another emergency meeting, this time with proper notice. They voted to suspend all enforcement actions under the disputed guidelines and to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA's financial records. They also reached out to Jessica to discuss a potential settlement. "We might be able to resolve this without going to trial," Jessica told me during a phone call. "The new board seems genuinely interested in cleaning up the mess." I was skeptical. After everything they've put us through, why should we trust them now? "Because they're scared," Jessica explained. "The state investigation is serious, and they know it. If the commission finds evidence of fraud or other violations, individual board members could be held personally liable, not just the HOA, as an organization." The settlement negotiations began the following week. The new board, led now by Susan Reynolds, was cooperative and transparent. They agreed to drop all fines issued under the disputed guidelines, to refund fines already paid, and to adopt new procedures for guideline changes and enforcement actions. They also agreed to commission a new survey of the entire community to verify property lines and to establish an independent ombudsman to handle homeowner complaints. But Jessica wasn't satisfied. "What about the homeowners who already paid to remove or modify structures? What about the business that went to Mrs. Davenport's company?" The negotiations continued for several more weeks. Finally, the HOA agreed to establish a restitution fund to compensate homeowners who had incurred expenses due to the improper enforcement actions. They also agreed to terminate their contract with Mrs. Davenport's landscaping company and to implement a new bidding process for all HOA contracts. As part of the settlement, Mrs. Davenport and the other former board members who had resigned agreed not to seek positions on the HOA board for 5 years and to cooperate with the state investigation. The Texas Real Estate Commission's investigation was still ongoing, but the settlement was a major victory for homeowners. I still can't believe how quickly things turned around once people started speaking up. That's the lesson here. Silence allows abuse to continue. But when people find their voice, when they stand together, change happens. It doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like, and it doesn't always happen easily, but it happens. The settlement agreement was formally approved by the court 6 months after I first received that fateful violation notice. In the end, 32 homeowners received refunds for fines they had paid, and 17 more were compensated for expenses incurred to comply with the improper enforcement actions. The total amount paid by the HOA was nearly $250. The community survey revealed that approximately 15% of the properties in Heritage Heights had been incorrectly mapped in the HOA's records. In some cases, the discrepancies were minor, a few inches here or there. In others, like mine, they were significant. My fence, it turned out, was not just compliant with the property line, it was actually 3 feet inside my property, not 2 as I had originally thought. The HOA had been using incorrect property line data for years, and no one had bothered to verify it until now. The new board, under Susan's leadership, implemented sweeping changes. They revised the architectural guidelines with proper input from homeowners, including a grandfather clause for existing structures. They established a transparent process for handling violations, with clear appeals, procedures, and oversight from a homeowner advisory committee. They also commissioned an independent audit of the HOA's finances, which revealed several irregularities beyond what we had already uncovered. The audit findings were shared with all homeowners, along with a detailed plan to address the issues. The Texas Real Estate Commission's investigation concluded with a finding that the HOA had violated several state laws, including failure to provide proper notification of guideline changes and failure to maintain accurate financial records. The Commission imposed a $50 fine on the HOA and required additional training for board members. Perhaps most satisfyingly, the State Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Mrs. Davenport's landscaping company and its relationship with the HOA. That investigation was still ongoing, but there was talk of potential charges for fraud and unjust enrichment. Life in Heritage Heights gradually returned to normal, though it was a new normal. The community had been through a lot, and trust had been broken. But the new board's transparency and commitment to fairness was slowly rebuilding that trust. My neighbors who had avoided me during the height of the conflict began to wave again. Some even stopped to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I didn't want to get involved, one neighbor admitted. I was worried about my property values. But I see now that what you did was right. The fence that started it all still stands in my backyard, a silent reminder of the battle that was fought. Sometimes, when I look at it, I still feel a surge of anger at what the HOA tried to do. But more often, I feel pride. Pride in standing up for what was right. Pride in being part of a group that refused to be bullied. You know, the ironic thing about all of this is that I never set out to be an activist or a community leader. I'm just a retired Army guy who wanted to enjoy his peaceful suburban life. But sometimes, life has other plans for you. Sometimes, the quiet retiree becomes the warrior once again, not on a battlefield, but in a homeowners association meeting. A year after the settlement, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset, the same fence that caused all this trouble standing silently nearby. The neighborhood was quiet, the way it used to be before the conflict, but everything had changed. The Heritage Heights HOA was now a model of transparency and homeowner involvement. Susan Reynolds had been elected president in a landslide, and the new board had implemented numerous reforms based on recommendations from homeowners and state regulators. Property values, contrary to the HOA's dire warnings, had actually increased. The local real estate market was strong, and Heritage Heights was now known as a community where homeowners' rights were respected. I had received numerous requests from homeowners in other communities facing similar HOA issues. "How did you do it?" they asked. "How did you fight back and win?" The answer, I realized, was both simple and complex. It involved knowing your rights, doing your research, building alliances, and refusing to back down when you know you're right. But more than that, it involved recognizing when something bigger than yourself is at stake. This wasn't just about my fence or my 10-0 fine. It was about fairness, transparency, and accountability. It was about standing up to abuse of power, whether that abuse comes from a government, a corporation, or a homeowners association. Looking back, I can identify several key lessons from this experience. 1. Know your rights and your documents. The original survey of my property was the key piece of evidence that changed everything. Without it, the HOA might have succeeded in their claim that my fence was in violation. Every homeowner should know where their property lines are, what their HOA bylaws say, and what rights they have under state law. 2. Document everything. From the first violation notice to every conversation with HOA representatives, I kept detailed records. Those records became crucial evidence in our lawsuit. 3. Build alliances. I couldn't have done this alone. From my daughter Sarah to the other homeowners who joined the lawsuit, from Bill Jensen to Susan Reynolds, allies made all the difference. 4. Use the system. We used the legal system, the media, state regulatory agencies, and the court of public opinion. Each played a role in achieving our goals. 5. Stay calm and focused. There were times when I wanted to lash out in anger, when I wanted to confront Mrs. Davenport and the other board members directly. But keeping a cool head and staying focused on the facts and the legal process was more effective in the long run. 6. Be prepared for a long fight. This didn't happen overnight. It took months of research, legal action, and public pressure to achieve our goals. Quick fixes are rare in these situations. T. Recognize when to compromise. The settlement we reached wasn't everything we initially wanted, but it addressed the most important issues and provided real relief to affected homeowners. Sometimes, a partial victory that actually happens is better than a perfect victory that remains out of reach. As I sat there reflecting on these lessons, my phone rang. It was a reporter from a national publication that was doing a story on HOA reform across the country. Your case has become something of a touchstone for homeowners' rights advocates, the reporter said. People are looking to Heritage Heights as an example of what's possible when homeowners stand together. I found that both gratifying and a little overwhelming. I never set out to be a symbol or an example. I just wanted to be left alone about my fence. But if our experience could help others facing similar situations, then perhaps all the stress and conflict had been worth it. Discussion quiz. In 1. What was the key piece of evidence that changed the direction of this HOA dispute? A. The original property survey. B. Testimony from other homeowners. C. Financial records from the HOA. D. Media coverage. 2. What was the primary motivation behind the HOA's enforcement actions? A. Maintaining property values. B. Ensuring community standards. C. Generating revenue through fines. D. Responding to homeowner complaints. 3. What was the most effective strategy for resolving this dispute? A. Direct confrontation with HOA board members. B. Legal action combined with public pressure. C. Compromise and negotiation from the beginning. D. Involving state regulatory agencies. 4. What lesson do you think is most important for homeowners in HOA communities? A. Always comply with HOA rules to avoid conflict. B. Know your rights and document everything. C. Avoid getting involved in HOA politics. D. Move if you don't like the HOA rules. 2 years after the settlement, life in Heritage Heights has settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA is now responsive to homeowners, transparent in its operations, and focused on maintaining the community rather than generating revenue through fines. Susan Reynolds continues to lead the HOA board, and under her guidance, the community has thrived. Property values are up, homeowner satisfaction is high, and the bitter divisions that once split the neighborhood have largely healed. I've become something of an informal advisor to homeowners in other communities facing HOA issues. I don't give legal advice that's for lawyers like my daughter Sarah, but I do share my experience and the lessons I learned. It all comes down to this. I told a group of homeowners from a neighboring community last month, you have rights. Your HOA has obligations. When those rights are respected and those obligations are met, everyone benefits. When they're not, you have to stand up for yourself. I never thought I'd be giving talks about HOA rights in my retirement. I planned to travel, to spend time with my grandchildren, to enjoy the peace and quiet I had earned after 25 years in the Army. And I do those things. I've taken Sarah's kids to Disney World. I've visited old Army buddies. I've spent lazy afternoons fishing at a nearby lake. But I've also found a new purpose in helping others navigate the complex and often frustrating world of HOAs. It's not the retirement I expected, but it's turned out to be meaningful in ways I never anticipated. The fence that started it all still stands in my backyard. It's weathered a bit, but it's still sturdy and reliable, much like the principles that guided me through this conflict. Sometimes, when I look at that fence, I think about how different my life might be if I had just paid the fine and removed it when the HOA first demanded it. I would have avoided months of stress, conflict, and legal battles. But I also would have allowed an injustice to stand unchallenged. I'm reminded of something my first commander in the Army told me. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. That's been true throughout my life, from my military service to my unexpected battle with the HOA. It's a lesson I hope to pass on to my grandchildren, and to anyone else who finds themselves facing a similar situation. You know, when this all started, I felt like a victim. I felt powerless against this big organization with all these rules and regulations. But I learned something important through this experience. Knowledge is power. Understanding your rights, understanding the system, understanding how to fight back, that's what turns a victim into a victor. And that's a lesson that applies to so much more than just HOA disputes. As I reflect on this journey, I've come to realize that what happened in Heritage Heights is part of a larger national conversation about the balance between community standards and individual property rights. HOAs were created with good intentions to maintain property values, to ensure community standards, to provide services that municipalities might not. And many HOAs fulfill that mission responsibly, with transparency and respect for homeowners. But too many HOAs have become miniature fiefdoms, where board members wield disproportionate power, where rules are enforced arbitrarily, and where homeowners have little recourse when things go wrong. The problem has grown as more and more Americans live in communities governed by HOAs. According to some estimates, over 70 million Americans now live in HOA-governed communities, and that number continues to grow. With that growth has come increased scrutiny from state legislatures and regulatory agencies. Many states have passed or are considering laws to strengthen homeowners' rights in HOA communities, to increase transparency, and to provide better mechanisms for resolving disputes. Our case in Heritage Heights has been cited in several of these legislative efforts. Lawmakers have pointed to it as an example of what can happen when HOAs operate without proper oversight and accountability. That's perhaps the most unexpected outcome of this entire experience, that what started as a dispute about a fence in a Texas suburb has contributed to a national conversation about property rights and governance. I've been asked to testify before a state legislative committee considering HOA reform measures. I've been interviewed by national media outlets. I've even been invited to speak at a conference on property rights. None of this was on my radar when I received that first violation notice. I was just a retiree trying to enjoy his home. But sometimes, life takes unexpected turns, and we find ourselves in roles we never imagined. I don't consider myself an activist or an expert on HOA law. I'm just a homeowner who refused to be bullied, who did his research, and who was fortunate enough to have allies who joined the fight. But if my experience can help others, if it can contribute to positive change in how HOAs operate, then perhaps all the stress and conflict was worth it. As I sit on my back porch watching the sunset, I think about the future of Heritage Heights and communities like it across the country. I think about the balance between community standards and individual rights, about the importance of transparency and accountability, about the power of ordinary people to stand up and make a difference. And I feel hopeful, not just for my community, but for all the homeowners out there who might be facing similar situations. Because if there's one thing I've learned through this experience, it's that change is possible when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. If you're watching this and you're dealing with your own HOA issues, I want you to know something. You're not alone. There are resources available. There are people who can help. And there are solutions out there. Don't let them intimidate you. Don't let them make you feel powerless. Know your rights, document everything, build alliances, and stand your ground. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. And who knows? You might just end up making a difference not just for yourself, but for your entire community. As I bring this story to a close, I want to share a few final thoughts that I hope will be helpful to anyone watching this who might be facing their own HOA challenges. First, remember that you have rights. Your home is your castle, as the saying goes, and even in an HOA community, there are limits to what the association can require or prohibit. State laws vary, but most provide some protections for homeowners. Second, do your homework. Read your HOA's governing documents. Understand the rules and the process for changing them. Know your property lines and any restrictions on your land. Knowledge is power, and the more you know, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for yourself. Third, document everything. Keep copies of all communications with your HOA. Take photos, save emails, create a timeline of events. If you end up in a dispute, this documentation will be invaluable. Fourth, build relationships with your neighbors. You don't have to be best friends with everyone, but knowing who your allies are can make a big difference when conflicts arise. And remember that today's adversary might be tomorrow's ally. People can and do change their minds. Fifth, choose your battles wisely. Not every rule or enforcement action is worth fighting over. Sometimes, compliance is the path of least resistance. But when something important is at stake, when your rights are being violated, when you're being treated unfairly, then it's worth standing your ground. Sixth, use the system. There are mechanisms in place for addressing HOA disputes, from internal appeal processes to state regulatory agencies to the courts. Understand how these systems work and use them to your advantage. Finally, remember that change takes time. The HOA landscape didn't become what it is overnight, and it won't be reformed overnight either. But every small victory, every precedent set, every homeowner who stands up for their rights contributes to the larger movement for fairness and accountability. As for me, I'm enjoying my retirement, spending time with family, and occasionally advising other homeowners who find themselves in situations similar to mine. The fence that started it all still stands in my backyard, a silent reminder of the battle that was fought and won. And sometimes, when I'm sitting on my back porch watching the sunset, I think about how different things might have been if I had just paid that fine and removed my fence when the HOA first demanded it. I would have avoided months of stress and conflict. But I also would have allowed an injustice to stand unchallenged. I would have missed the opportunity to make a difference not just for myself, but for my entire community. And that, I think, would have been the greatest loss of all. You know, they say that good fences make good neighbors. And I suppose there's some truth to that. But what I've learned through this experience is that good boundaries make good communities. Boundaries between what's acceptable and what's not. Boundaries that protect homeowners from abuse of power. Boundaries that ensure fairness and transparency. Those are the kinds of boundaries that really matter in the end. As I conclude this story, I want to leave you with a call to action, a way to turn the lessons from my experience into positive change in your own community. First, if you live in an HOA community, get involved. Attend board meetings, read the newsletters, understand the issues facing your community. You don't have to run for the board, though that's not a bad idea. But being an informed and engaged homeowner is the first step toward ensuring your HOA operates fairly and transparently. Second, know your rights. Take the time to understand your state's laws regarding HOAs. Many states have specific statutes that govern what HOAs can and cannot do, how they must operate, and what rights homeowners have. This knowledge is your first line of defense against abuse. Third, build community. Connect with your neighbors, not just socially, but as fellow homeowners with a shared interest in maintaining a fair and well-managed community. When homeowners stand together, they're much more effective at holding HOAs accountable. Fourth, document everything. Keep copies of all communications with your HOA. Take photos of your property. Save records of any improvements or changes you make. This documentation can be invaluable if disputes arise. Fifth, speak up. If you see something that doesn't seem right, a rule that's being enforced unfairly, a board decision that lacks transparency, a fine that seems excessive, say something. Your voice matters. And speaking up can prevent small issues from becoming big problems. Finally, remember that you're not alone. There are resources available to help homeowners navigate HOA issues. From legal aid organizations to homeowner advocacy groups to online communities where people share their experiences and advice. As for me, I'll continue to enjoy my retirement, my family, and my home. The fence that started it all still stands in my backyard, a silent reminder of the battle that was fought and won. And sometimes, when new neighbors move in and ask about the history of the community, I share my story not to dwell on the past, but to help ensure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated. Because that's what it's all about, isn't it? Learning from our experiences, both good and bad, and using that knowledge to create better communities for everyone. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's difficult. Even when it's unpopular, even when it seems like you're fighting a battle you can't possibly win. Because the alternative, allowing injustice to stand unchallenged, is far worse. So know your rights, document everything, build alliances, and never, ever underestimate the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary changes. Thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best in your own homeowner's journey. What's your experience with HOAs? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for your rights against an HOA? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. How do you think HOAs will evolve over the next decade? Will they become more homeowner-friendly? Or will we see more conflicts like the one I experienced? Share your predictions in the comments. What's the most important lesson you've learned from a conflict in your community or neighborhood? How did that experience change you? Let me know in the comments. I'm always interested to hear about others' experiences.